The captains bowed their heads, and when they looked up again, behold, their enemies were flying, and the power of Mordor was scattering like dust in the wind. As when death smites the swollen brooding thing that inhabits their crawling hill and holds them all in sway, ants will wander witless and purposeless and then feebly die, so the creatures of Sauron, orc or troll, or beast spell enslaved, ran hither and thither mindless, and some slew themselves, or cast themselves in pits, or fled wailing back to hide in the holes and dark lightless places far from hope.
What happened to the race of orcs following the downfall of Sauron? The Field of Cormallen chapter paints a bleak picture of the fate of those serving Sauron in Mordor. Willing servants and unwilling slaves alike. Is it possible that orcs could find some peace in the Fourth Age of the world after their tormentor and master Sauron was cast down? What would we even describe as peace for the most loathed and violent race in Middle-earth? Their nature and history tell us that chances of peace were slim. This video will aim to answer various questions related to orcs in the Fourth Age. Why did those orcs in Mordor react to Sauron's defeat in the way that they did? What about orcs outside of the direct influence of Mordor? Those orcs who had not yet been drawn to that land. What happened to orcs when Sauron's master Morgoth was defeated at the end of the First Age? The one who made them and was removed from their influence. And how would things be different this time following Sauron's defeat? Is there any hope at all that they would survive as a race? I will try to answer all of these questions, referencing Tolkien's thoughts on the redeemability of orcs, plenty of my own speculation regarding the landscape of the Fourth Age when it comes to peace for the orcs, and I will hopefully show that there is much we cannot know for certain when it comes to not only the Fourth Age of Tolkien's Middle-earth, but the fate of the race of orcs. The race that exists in the Legendarium with an abundance of unanswered and unanswerable questions. First, let's look at what happened when the One Ring was destroyed and Sauron was diminished. As the ring was unmade, all that was wrought with the power bound within it was also unmade. We see the land itself crumble. The Tower of Barad-dûr, with its foundations bound to the ring, collapses in violence. The Towers of the Teeth fail. The once insurmountable Black Gate is gone. And even the Ringwraiths themselves are said to come shooting like flaming bolts, caught in the fiery ruin of hill and sky. They crackle, wither, and go out. And the once vast and indomitable will of Sauron also goes out. As he calls out of the Dark Tower in anguish, his host trembles. They are filled with doubt, laughter dies, and their hands shake. Tolkien tells us that the power that drove them on and filled them with hate and fury was wavering. Its will was removed from them. The Eye of Sauron is not a fiery eyeball atop a dark tower. It is also more than a title, Red Eye or Great Eye. It is the unyielding vigilance and presence of the Dark Lord's will, piercing the mind of his slaves, orcs being creatures ill-equipped to fight it. In fact, orcs more than any other race would fall victim to the will of Sauron, and they have Morgoth to thank for that. As Sauron took up his position as a self-proclaimed king of the world and lord of the earth, he filled orcs and other evil creatures with a purpose following Morgoth's removal from the world. Purpose and hate. Sauron was violently removed from his seat of power, and that will that many of these creatures had been directly controlled by for so long was gone in a brief moment of time. These creatures, who we should pity for the level of control Sauron held over them, were left naked in the dark, without purpose, frightened and confused. Some take their own lives, throwing themselves in pits, or escape to the dark places of the world in the hope they will never be found. No purpose, no thought for the future. We are witnessing the madness that ensues in the race of orcs when they are released from thraldom and a guiding dark hand. Tolkien offers a, let's face it, brutal description of what happened to orcs in Mordor when Sauron's will was broken, and when they became free. Orcs as a race existed from the time of the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, and they have only had brief periods of time without these Dark Lords controlling them. These orcs we are witnessing in Mordor are those orcs who had been long enslaved. The dominion of Sauron was arguably absolute, nothing less than corruption and cruelty on a grand scale, a mockery of the gift of free will. His loss was their loss, a shock to the system, and it's hard to imagine that any orc witnessing Sauron's end would survive for long to speak of it, and any that did would most likely never be seen again, existing in dark pits until they too meet their end. Before we move into the Fourth Age, let's go back to the end of the First Age and the dawn of the Second. It was Morgoth, not Sauron, who, according to Tolkien's late writings, was the source of not only orcs, but orc wills. Tolkien tells us that Sauron is just another, if greater, agent, one who can use his own strength of will to dominate another. Orcs can rebel against him without losing their own irremediable allegiance to evil. So great was Morgoth's dominance that orcs had lost almost all possibility of resisting his will. If Morgoth turned his thought to them, they were conscious of his eye, a similar idea to the eye of Sauron mentioned earlier, wherever they were. When Morgoth was taken at the end of the First Age and removed from Arda itself, his will was clearly removed from their sphere of influence. They were scattered, leaderless and almost witless. They formed smaller groups, fought each other, and existed for a time without control or purpose. They didn't prosper or become a threat to Middle-earth again until the rise of Sauron. But why didn't all of these orcs cast themselves into deep pits in their despair when Morgoth was defeated? The first reason could be that the orcs that remained after the War of Wrath ended did not witness the diminishment of Melkor's will. He was cast through the Door of Night after the war ended, after he had been carried back to Valinor. It wasn't so abrupt. Yet they must have still suffered the shock and realization that he was gone, no matter where they were. Such was the influence he had on them. Their minds, like those of Sauron's orcs, were free at that moment. I think the main reason we witness such violence in Sauron's defeat is due to the greater control that Sauron held over the orcs. While everything Morgoth achieved was greater in scale, his armies, his hold over Middle-earth, even Morgoth's ring compared with Sauron's ring of power, Sauron, it is said, had greater control over orcs than Morgoth ever had, despite not being their maker, and I say maker here, not creator. The advantage Sauron held here was due to the nature of Middle-earth in the Second Age. Tolkien tells us that Sauron was operating on a much smaller scale, but that he also had no enemies that were so great and so fell as the Noldor in their might in the First Age. Thus Sauron was able to hold the mastery of their wills, uniting them in time through an unreasoning hatred of elves and men, leading orcs to become so full of hatred that he was able to lord over them by wielding it as a weapon, to the point where an orc would slay himself if Sauron commanded it. His control relied on overcoming what Tolkien called a flaw in the kingdom of hate and fear, with hate being the strongest thing in such a kingdom. Sauron had to focus orcs onto an enemy, lest they kill each other in their hatred. Sauron seemed to be successful, and we witnessed the effects of his will being removed, causing greater anguish than the removal of the original Dark Lord. Despite Sauron's greater control, he had not yet gained control of every orc, though I believe given enough time, and especially if he had recovered the One Ring, he would have held mastery over all of them. The fact remains that he hadn't yet. We know this because Saruman was one of these agents Tolkien described, able to hold mastery over other beings, his Uruk-hai. Though earlier in the Third Age, we are told that in the last years of Denethor I, the race of Uruks, black orcs of great strength, first appeared out of Mordor, Sauron's attempt at his own breed of orcs. Saruman later made his own. There is no doubt that long afterwards in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered this, or learned of it in lore, and in his lust for mastery committed this, his wickedest deed, the interbreeding of orcs and men, producing both men orcs large and cunning, and orc men treacherous and vile.
For these Isengarders are more like wicked men. It is a mark of evil things that came in the great darkness that they cannot abide in the sun. But Saruman's orcs can endure it, even if they hate it. I wonder what he has done. Are they men that he has turned, or has he blended the races of orcs and men? And that would be a black evil.
Even with Uruk being a translation of orc, Tolkien is clear that both Sauron's Uruks and Saruman's Uruk-hai are different from what came before. I'm sure Saruman's Uruk-hai could have eventually sided with Sauron, this being they hadn't known, and the superior will when compared to their master. But that is a topic for another day. Orcs existed that didn't kill themselves or flee when Sauron was defeated. What could have happened to them? Those orcs who worked for Sauron in lands outside of Mordor, such as the Misty Mountains or elsewhere. I'd have to speculate that orcs coming above ground, attempting to settle or form their own independent groups, would be met by the extending borders and populations of mostly men in Middle-earth. Even though the wise in the elder days taught that the orcs were not in their origin evil, they may have become irredeemable, at least according to elves and men. These are not the elder days. Men at this time have warred with orcs and only known them as the enemy. It's hard to imagine in the West a peaceful coexistence between these races. Again, my speculation is that orcs would be destroyed over time, or dwindle through a lack of an external agent, forcing their breeding or reproduction to populate armies. War was over, meaning Tolkien's sentiments of orcs surrendering and asking for mercy that must be granted may not apply here. Men would multiply, spread throughout the land, and would not share their land with orcs. I imagine hunts, raiding parties, random orcs being discovered and slain on sight, a dwindling population, with no external will forcing them to outnumber their enemies. Each orc slain leads the western population further into extinction. Even populations of orcs in areas such as Moria would have dwindled, though this text may have been abandoned by Tolkien, as it only appears in a history of Appendix A, Durin's folk. There it speaks of the last Durin, during the 7th, returning to Moria in the 4th Age. The dwarves' hatred of orcs is arguably greater than the race of men's, with the brutal slaying of Thror of a royal line, heir of Durin, by the orc Azog, leading to the war of the dwarves and orcs. Do we have to imagine what dwarves would do to orcs hiding in Moria upon their return to reclaim that kingdom? Possibly with a larger force, a new king, and a lack of a Balrog to get in the way. And the line of Dain prospered, and the wealth and renown of the kingship was renewed, until there arose again for the last time an heir of that house that bore the name of Durin, and he returned to Moria, and there was light again in deep places, and the ringing of hammers and the harping of harps, until the world grew old, and the dwarves failed, and the days of Durin's race were ended. As this is speculation, I like to imagine that orcs may have fled east and south, to those kingdoms of wicked men who still fought against the kingdoms of Rohan and Gondor well into the 4th Age, following Sauron's defeat. We are told that King Eomer of Rohan rode east to fulfill the Oath of Earl with King Elisar. They would war with Harad and those beyond the Sea of Rhûn. I would not be surprised if orcs fought with men in the 4th Age against the men of the West. Maybe not out of some loyalty to Sauron, but for their existence, or due to that unyielding hatred that had been bred into them. Author of the Unfinished, A Song of Ice and Fire series, George R.R. Martin, speaks of orc genocide in an interview. He asks if Aragorn would pursue a policy of systematic genocide against orcs. This actually gives weight to the idea that orcs may have continued to exist elsewhere. Those of us who understand the figure of Aragorn probably have an easier time imagining his mercy as king, and his wisdom as being closer to those who shared wisdom of the elder days. This idea that while orcs must be fought with utmost severity, they can't be treated with in their own terms of cruelty and treachery. I can't see Aragorn implementing some policy to wipe them out, but I stick by what I have said, that orcs and men, of the West at least, would not coexist. Fighting would continue if they met. I also don't see the lands given to the slaves of Sauron by Aragorn as being land given to orcs, but given to those of the race of men brought to Mordor from distant lands to serve him. The Hobbit hints that orcs may yet exist, possibly being the creators of modern weaponry, eventually reaching a point where they were indistinguishable from wicked men. This can be read in another way, with evil men becoming indistinguishable from orcs, who had long exited the world as some independent race. The culmination of Sauron and Saruman's possible black evil, as Treebeard described it, the blending of orcs and men. I imagine the men of the West fighting against forces consisting of some orcs and men, being unable to distinguish a difference as the 4th Age marches on, being unwilling to see a difference. The race of orcs reduced to a memory lost as the years pass and men who fought against Sauron's forces leave the world. I'm reminded of Tolkien's abandoned story, The New Shadow, taking place in the 4th Age, at a time when few would remember orcs. The term has been reduced to an insult. Children play at orcs, and misdeeds are called orcs' work or orcish. Tolkien indirectly telling us that the future was not bright for their race. Where are the orcs at this time? Reduced to stories, tales told by elders. They didn't prosper, they dwindled, and any that remained would be reduced to hiding far from those who would fear them or slay them, until they were gone.
They would.
grunted Gorbag.
We'll see. But anyway, if it does go well, there should be a lot more room. What do you say? If we get a chance, you and me'll slip off and set up somewhere on our own, with a few trusty lads, somewhere where there's good loot nice and handy, and no big bosses.
Said Shagrat.
Like old times.
This is all very bleak, but is there any hope for the race of orcs? Or does their possible redemption only occur when they die? Perhaps it is only Eru who can redeem them. Such is the level of their corruption, Morgoth's greatest evil. Even orcs serving Sauron in the War of the Ring seemed to dream of moving away from servitude under big bosses. It's just unfortunate that in what seems like their nature, orcs would return to infighting, to violence, peace from big bosses merely leading to smaller bosses, rivalries, an inability to coexist with others outside their small band or territory. The full nature of orcs really is unknown to us, even if the published Silmarillion says they were once corrupted from elves, an idea Tolkien himself moved away from in later years. Even if this were the case, they became a race. Not all orcs are elves, that's just not how it works. Orcs breed to produce orcs. But what are they? Do they possess souls? Can an orc be good? These are deep questions that will never be appropriately answered. Letter 153 does give us some of Tolkien's thoughts on the problem of orcs. They would be Morgoth's greatest sins, abuses of his highest privilege, and would be creatures begotten of sin, and naturally bad. I nearly wrote irredeemably bad, but that would be going too far, because by accepting or tolerating their making, necessary to their actual existence, even orcs would become part of the world, which is God's and ultimately good. But whether they could have souls or spirits seems a different question. And since in my myth, at any rate, I do not conceive of the making of souls or spirits, things of an equal order, if not an equal power to the Valar, as a possible delegation I have represented at least the orcs as pre-existing real beings, on whom the Dark Lord has exerted the fullness of his power in remodeling and corrupting them, not making them. We have no examples of orcs being redeemed, and as I said earlier, it could be that their corruption was so deep in their nature and existence that it would take a power beyond their will or any other on earth to reshape them. This means their redemption may be found in death, if they have a path in death, through Eru. Again, who knows this for sure? Much like with Sauron and even Morgoth, they can't be irredeemable as Tolkien says, but the chance may be so remote that it was never going to happen in their short lives on Earth. The orcs only been given a brief respite from the torture of serving Dark Lords. The Fourth Age is the age of mankind, a prosperous time for the Second Born. I do not see such prosperity in the race of orcs. I imagine a slow decay, a scattered race driven from hidden places, or slain by the ever-growing populations of men, most of whom would still view them as monsters. Not enough time to change, to be redeemed, a process that would be glacial, and orcs would have not had such time to change. Their harsh existence would come to an end one way or another. Did orcs of the Fourth Age find peace? I say their peace would only come following their demise. No longer bound to Dark Lords, no longer forced to hate or fight, free in death. Thanks for watching this video on the orcs of Middle-earth. As you may have noticed, I can't really answer some of these questions with any certainty. Such is the confusing nature of orcs. My speculation will have to suffice. Tolkien himself struggled with such questions, so what chance do I have? These are just my somewhat pessimistic views of 4th Age orcs, an age that was so far removed from the origin of orcs that they may no longer have had any place. But since a lot of this is just my opinion, I am eager to hear what you think about orcs in the 4th Age. Would they continue to exist? Would Aragorn lead a George R.R. Martin campaign of slaughter? Or would orcs dwindle through a lack of purpose or drive to continue? Thanks again, and I hope you will subscribe to help the channel if you haven't already.